The heat in Fort Kavanaugh was relentless. It clung to the skin like a second layer, suffocating and inescapable. Even in the shade of the towering barracks, the air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel labored. The scent of sweat, sun-baked asphalt, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil lingered in the air, creating an atmosphere that felt as heavy as the training gear the recruits carried. It was September 2010, and for the new soldiers arriving at the base in rural Georgia, the scorching climate was just another test of endurance. Darius Holloway stood in formation alongside his fellow recruits, his posture rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead, muscles tensed under the weight of his uniform. He was 19, lean but strong, his frame hardened by years of physical labor and restless determination. His dark skin glistened under the oppressive sun, beads of sweat sliding down his temple, but he didn't allow himself to flinch. He had spent his whole life preparing for moments like this, learning how to hide exhaustion, how to suppress discomfort, how to make himself unbreakable. Growing up in Atlanta, he had quickly learned that dreams were fragile things. His neighborhood was the kind that swallowed ambition whole, chewing it up with the sharp teeth of poverty and spitting it out as disappointment. He had seen too many boys like himself start with promise only to be dragged down by circumstances beyond their control, violence, addiction, the suffocating weight of expectations too low to climb out of. He had refused to be one of them. The army had been his escape plan. College had never been a realistic option. His grades had been decent, but not enough to secure a scholarship, and money was something his family had never had to spare. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and his father had never been in the picture. The military offered stability, structure, a chance to carve out a future where none had existed before. The first days of basic training had been a shock to his system. The drill sergeants wasted no time in breaking down every shred of individuality the recruits carried with them. They stripped them of their names, their pasts, their sense of self, reducing them to a single common identity: soldier. Wake up before dawn. Run until your legs screamed. Push your body beyond what it had ever known. Fail, and you'd be punished. Succeed, and you'd still be pushed harder. It was a relentless cycle of exhaustion and discipline, and Darius embraced it without complaint. The physical trials were grueling, but they weren't what concerned him the most. He could handle the running, the weight of the gear, the endless drills under the sun. He had expected the pain, the sweat, the aching muscles. What he hadn't expected was the way he could feel eyes on him even when no one was looking directly at him. At first, he ignored it. He chalked it up to paranoia, to the natural stress of being surrounded by strangers who were all fighting to prove themselves. But it became harder to dismiss as the days stretched into weeks. The glances lingered too long. The pauses in conversation when he entered a room became too frequent. He could feel something shifting in the air around him, an invisible tide turning against him. The third week, he began to hear the whispers. They started small, nothing more than murmurs just out of reach, words lost in the noise of the barracks or drowned out by the roar of the drill instructors. But the tone was unmistakable, speculative, mocking, sharp. It didn't take long for the rumors to gain traction. Someone noticed that Darius never talked about girls. It wasn't that he avoided the topic, he just didn't engage in the usual conversations. While the other recruits swapped stories about conquests, crude jokes about women, and exaggerated boasts about their exploits, he remained silent. He wasn't uncomfortable, he had just never seen the appeal in pretending. Someone else pointed out that he was too quiet, too controlled, never laughing along when the others cracked their usual jokes, never joining in when the conversations veered toward the obscene. He had always been reserved, even back home, but here, in this hypermasculine world, silence was ammunition for suspicion. Then came the locker room incident. It had been nothing, a brief, almost imperceptible moment. He had been changing after an afternoon of grueling drills, peeling his sweat-soaked shirt from his back, when his gaze had briefly met another recruit's in the mirror. He hadn't meant anything by it. But he had looked away too fast. It had been too quick, too intentional. That was all it took. Once the seed had been planted, it didn't need watering. The rumors spread like wildfire, passed between recruits in hushed conversations and exchanged glances. Darius had seen this happen before. He knew how these things worked. It didn't matter whether it was true or not. It didn't matter that he had never said a word, that he had never done anything to invite suspicion. Perception was reality, and in this world, perception could be deadly. He tried to ignore it. He told himself that as long as he kept his head down, as long as he did everything right, it would blow over. He pushed himself harder, determined to prove that he was just another soldier, no different from anyone else. But in the barracks, in the mess hall, in the moments between training, he could feel the distance growing. The subtle shifts in body language. The way conversations would halt when he walked by. The way laughter would start again once he had passed. And then, one night, someone left a message on his bunk. A single word, scrawled in thick black marker across his neatly folded blanket. He stared at it for a long time, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't touch it. He didn't react. He simply sat down, his face a mask of indifference, and waited for lights out. He had spent his entire life fighting to belong, to prove that he was worthy of the space he occupied. But for the first time, he felt something deeper than frustration, deeper than anger. He felt fear. The harassment started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper carried by the wind, too faint to hold onto but persistent enough to unsettle. It was in the smirks exchanged between recruits when Darius walked past, the lingering looks followed by barely contained laughter. It was the sudden silence when he entered a room, the way conversations shifted, eyes darting toward him with veiled amusement or quiet malice. At first, he told himself it was nothing. He had learned long ago how to ignore things that didn't serve him, how to keep his head down and push forward. But the whispers turned to words, sharp and deliberate, muttered just loud enough for him to hear. They called him names under their breath at roll call, their voices low but heavy with meaning. In the mess hall, when he sat down, those around him would shift away, as if his presence alone was enough to sour their appetite. On the field, during drills, they bumped into him harder than necessary, knocking him off balance and acting as if it had been unintentional. They took their time moving aside when he tried to pass, forcing him to squeeze through spaces that suddenly felt too small. Then, the nameless aggression turned into something tangible. His things began to disappear, his PT uniform one morning, his boots another. Sometimes, his gear was found soaked in water or covered in filth, thrown carelessly in the showers or tossed onto the muddy field outside. He'd return to his bunk at the end of the day to find his carefully folded sheets crumpled, his blanket kicked onto the floor. Once, he opened his footlocker to find his neatly pressed dress uniform slashed down the back, the fabric ruined. The messages carved into his personal belongings were worse. The first time he saw one, scrawled onto the underside of his bunk in thick, black marker, he had stared at it for a long time before wiping it away with a damp rag. He had hoped it was a one-time thing, a moment of juvenile cruelty that would pass, but the next day, another message appeared. And another. Soon, it wasn't just words. Someone had taken a razor to his spare undershirt, slicing through the fabric with slow, deliberate precision. His boots, once polished to a perfect shine, were filled with sand one morning, forcing him to shake them out as laughter echoed behind him. It became clear that this wasn't going to stop. The officers didn't intervene. If anything, they seemed to encourage it. Hardship builds character, they said. Toughen up. Learn to take it. No one wanted to hear complaints. No one cared about fairness. This was the military, and in the military, weakness was a liability. Darius wasn't weak. But no one could withstand what was coming along. Nights were the worst. He had started sleeping lightly, flinching at every sound, anticipating the inevitable. The first time it happened, he had been in a deep, exhausted sleep when ice-cold water splashed across his face, shocking him awake. Laughter erupted from the darkness, the shadows around him shifting as figures moved away. By the time he sat up, heart hammering, all he could hear was the fading sound of retreating footsteps. The second time, they hit him. Not hard enough to leave visible bruises, just enough to hurt, to remind him that he wasn't safe even in the place where he was supposed to rest. Fists landed in quick, controlled bursts, precise in their cruelty. Someone covered his mouth with a rough hand, muffling his shouts. Another night, they stuffed a dirty sock into his mouth, pressing it against his tongue until he gagged. The taste was unbearable, the suffocating pressure against his lips making his stomach churn. They held it there just long enough to terrify him before pulling away and laughing as he coughed, gasping for air. He stopped fighting back. It only made things worse. He learned to wake at the slightest sound, to brace himself before the blows landed. He learned to keep his possessions locked away, though it didn't always help. He learned not to react, no matter what they did, because his silence seemed to frustrate them more than anything else. But no amount of endurance could make him immune to the exhaustion. Sleep deprivation took its toll. His hands trembled during drills, his focus slipped at critical moments. He ran on muscle memory, his body pushing forward on autopilot even as his mind begged for rest. His bones ached with fatigue, his joints stiff from tension that never fully released. And still, the torment continued. The isolation was suffocating. In the mess hall, no one spoke to him. In the barracks, he sat alone, pretending not to notice the way others moved away whenever he entered. In training exercises, he worked twice as hard, knowing that if he fell behind, there would be no one to help him. He wanted to believe it would get better. That eventually, they would get bored and move on. That maybe, just maybe, if he endured long enough, they would see him as one of them. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't something he could outlast. It wasn't going to stop. It was only going to get worse. The months stretched endlessly, each day blending into the next in an unbroken cycle of exhaustion and quiet torment. Darius stopped keeping track of time. The passing weeks meant nothing when every morning felt the same as the last, waking up in a damp, cold bunk, his body sore from unseen hands that struck in the dark, his mind dulled by restless sleep. He ate less. Not because he wanted to, but because his appetite had disappeared, replaced by a constant weight in his stomach. Food tasted like nothing, the act of chewing and swallowing an afterthought. Sometimes, he would sit in the mess hall, tray untouched, staring at the rows of recruits talking and laughing as if he were invisible. Other times, he forced himself to eat, shoveling tasteless bites into his mouth, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to keep going. Sleep was worse. The nights had become battlegrounds of their own, each one an exercise in survival. His body learned to react before his mind did, tensing at the creak of a bunk, flinching at the faintest rustle of movement. Even when no one came for him, he lay awake, listening, waiting. Every night, the same battle. Every morning, the same dull, aching defeat. But amidst the exhaustion, something else began to grow. Anger. It started as a quiet ember, barely noticeable beneath the layers of fear and fatigue. A flicker of heat in his chest when he heard their laughter, when he saw the way they looked at him. It burned hotter each time an officer ignored the obvious, each time his complaints were brushed aside. He was tired of being afraid. He was tired of feeling weak. At some point, he stopped trying to resist. He let them believe they had broken him. He kept his head down, his expression blank, his voice even. He moved through the days like a shadow, existing but never truly present. The others took it as a sign of surrender, their taunts becoming more brazen, their assaults more frequent. But Darius knew the truth. He was holding it all in. He could break once. Only once. And when he did, there would be no going back. The night of the training exercise in December was bitterly cold. A sharp wind cut through the trees, carrying the lingering scent of burnt wood and gunpowder from previous drills. The ground was frozen, brittle leaves crunching under heavy boots. The sky was an endless stretch of black, no stars visible through the thick clouds that loomed overhead. Darius walked with his unit through the training ground, rifle gripped tightly in his hands. They were meant to be running a simulated patrol, moving through the forest in formation, scanning for mock enemy positions. It was just another exercise, one of many, another night of pushing through the cold and exhaustion. Behind him, someone muttered something under their breath. He didn't react. The words were followed by a quiet chuckle, the kind that usually came before something worse. A hard shove against his shoulder. Not enough to knock him down, just enough to remind him of his place. He kept walking. Another voice joined in, louder this time, more deliberate. He could hear the amusement in it, the sick satisfaction of someone who knew there would be no consequences. The hand came next. A firm smack against the back of his head, a casual display of dominance, meant to provoke. Darius clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his rifle. He had taken worse. He had survived worse. But then, a voice, low, close, dripping with malice. A whisper against his ear. A single word. Something snapped. There was no thought, no hesitation. His body moved before his mind could catch up. The rifle swung up in an instant. The first shot rang out, cutting through the quiet. A sharp, deafening crack that echoed through the trees. Then another. And another. The world erupted in chaos. The first shot tore through the silence like a thunderclap, a single, deafening crack that sent a ripple of shock through the cold night air. The rifle in Darius's hands kicked back against his shoulder, the recoil sharp and immediate, but he barely registered it. His body had already moved on instinct, his training taking over, his breath steady despite the chaos erupting around him. The man closest to him, a fellow recruit, one of the worst tormentors, jerked backward as the bullet struck his chest. His body folded in on itself, collapsing to the ground in a heap, a choked gasp escaping his lips before he stopped moving altogether. The sound barely registered. The next shot came before the first body hit the dirt. Another figure staggered as a bullet ripped through his leg, sending him sprawling. The panicked scream that followed was quickly drowned out by the rapid succession of gunfire. Muzzle flashes flickered in the darkness like bursts of lightning, illuminating the terror-stricken faces of the soldiers who, just moments ago, had laughed at him, had whispered about him, had made his life a waking nightmare. Now, they were running. The training exercise had turned into a hunt, but they were no longer the ones in control. Darius moved with methodical precision, his hands steady, his breathing slow. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind felt clear, focused. There was no hesitation. His fingers squeezed the trigger in rhythmic bursts, each shot finding a target, each target another person who had made him suffer. Some tried to hide behind trees, ducking low, hoping the darkness would conceal them. But the training ground offered little cover, and Darius knew these woods just as well as they did. His rifle traced their movements, picking them off one by one. A recruit sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, his boots pounding against the frozen earth, breath coming in panicked gasps. The shot took him in the back. He collapsed forward, sliding a few feet before coming to a motionless stop. Another tried to fight back, raising his own weapon in desperation, but his hands were shaking too much to aim properly. Darius didn't give him the chance. A single round punched through his throat, and he crumpled without a sound. The forest echoed with screams, footsteps crashing through undergrowth, the desperate, ragged breaths of those who were still alive, still running. Some of them called out in confusion, unable to process what was happening. Others shouted his name, begging him to stop, but their voices barely reached him. He was beyond words. Beyond reason. The only thing that mattered was making sure they never touched him again. The rifle grew hot in his hands, the metal burning against his skin as he emptied round after round into the darkness. His ears rang from the endless barrage of gunfire, but he could still hear the desperate pleas, the sobs, the agonized moans of those who hadn't died instantly. He didn't care. He kept firing. The last shot rang out, cutting through the air like the final note of a violent symphony. Then, silence. Darius lowered the rifle, his breath steady but deep. The cold night air stung his skin, but he barely felt it. 15 bodies lay scattered around him, their uniforms dark with blood, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Some had died instantly, their expressions frozen in shock. Others still twitched, their bodies convulsing as life drained from them. A few moaned softly, the sound barely audible over the distant hum of approaching sirens. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the coppery scent of blood. Smoke curled from the barrel of his rifle, dissipating into the frigid wind. For the first time in months, no one was laughing. Distantly, he heard the dull roar of engines, the rhythmic beating of helicopter blades slicing through the night. The sirens grew louder, accompanied by the rapid stomp of boots against the frozen ground. Flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams scanning the carnage, bouncing off the trees and casting long, eerie shadows across the bodies. He didn't move. He stood in the center of the clearing, the rifle still hanging loosely in his hands, staring at nothing. He didn't resist when the soldiers reached him, their weapons raised, their voices barking orders. He didn't flinch when they forced him to the ground, their hands pressing his face into the cold dirt, his arms yanked behind his back. He didn't speak when they cuffed him, when they dragged him to his feet, when they shoved him toward the waiting transport. He only stared ahead, his expression unreadable, his mind eerily quiet. The night was over. But the storm was just beginning. The news broke before the blood had even dried. By dawn, the massacre at Fort Kavanaugh was the lead story on every major news network. Sensationalist headlines flooded television screens and online articles. Mass shooting on military base. Soldier kills 15 in cold blood. What is the army hiding? Images of the crime scene, blurred figures in uniform sprawled across the frozen ground, forensic teams combing the wreckage of what had once been a training exercise, were played on an endless loop. The nation erupted in shock. The military scrambled to control the narrative. High-ranking officials held emergency press conferences, their statements carefully crafted to distance the institution from the man now sitting in a high-security holding cell. They painted him as an outlier, a disturbed individual whose actions were neither predictable nor preventable. A psychotic break, some suggested. An undiagnosed mental disorder. The media devoured the story. They dug into his past, tracing his childhood in Atlanta, his enlistment, his time at Fort Kavanaugh. Every detail was dissected, every choice scrutinized. Was there something in his upbringing that hinted at violence? Did his mother know? Had there been warning signs? Former classmates, teachers, and neighbors were interviewed. Some described him as quiet, reserved, focused. Others, those who barely knew him, fed the frenzy with vague statements about his darkness, his distance, his inability to fit in. His military record was pulled apart in the court of public opinion. Recruits who had once stood beside him now spoke in hushed tones about his odd behavior, his silence, his refusal to bond with the others. They exaggerated his detachment, painted him as a ticking time bomb that no one had seen coming. Yet outside the carefully curated media spectacle, another story began to surface. Social media threads emerged, filled with testimonies from current and former service members. Anonymous posts from soldiers who had endured the same kind of treatment Darius had. They spoke of hazing disguised as discipline, of officers turning a blind eye, of the quiet, crushing violence that thrived in the barracks when no one was watching. It wasn't just Darius, they said. It never had been. The case ignited something raw. Protests broke out. Activists condemned the military's toxic culture, demanding an investigation into the treatment of marginalized soldiers. Others pushed back, insisting that Darius was a murderer, nothing more, that he deserved no sympathy. The divide widened. By the time the trial began, the world had already made up its mind. The courtroom was packed, the tension suffocating. Military officials filled the front rows, their expressions grim and unreadable. Rows of reporters lined the back, pens scratching against notepads, cameras flashing as Darius was led in. He was thinner now, his uniform hanging looser on his frame, his face unreadable as he took his seat. He never spoke. Not once. The prosecution wasted no time in building its case. They painted him as a monster, a traitor to the uniform he wore. They detailed every death in excruciating detail, listing the names of the fallen, the injuries sustained, the families left shattered in the aftermath. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man with a voice like steel, demanded the maximum sentence, death. They called witnesses, survivors who had watched their friends die, who had narrowly escaped. Some spoke with anger, others with fear, all of them with the certainty that Darius was a man who had snapped without cause, without justification. Then came the forensic evidence. The weapon used, the ballistics reports, the autopsy results. Every bullet had been placed with precision, every shot intentional. The prosecution argued that this was not the act of a man driven by desperation, but one of cold, calculated slaughter. Darius sat motionless through it all, his face a mask. The defense had little to work with. His attorneys, one a civilian lawyer specializing in high-profile cases, the other a military-appointed officer doing his best to salvage what he could, knew they weren't fighting for an acquittal. They were fighting for his life. They laid out the history of abuse. They brought in former soldiers who had suffered similar treatment, experts who detailed the long-standing culture of silence in the military, the systemic failure to protect those who were different. They presented evidence of the harassment Darius had endured, written threats, witness testimony, records of ignored complaints. They called psychologists to the stand, who testified about the psychological toll of prolonged trauma, about the breaking points of the human mind. It didn't matter. The jury wasn't listening. The court wasn't built for justice. It was built for order. The verdict was delivered swiftly. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom fell silent. Life without parole. No possibility of release. The prosecution had pushed for death, but even they seemed satisfied with the alternative. Darius didn't react. As he was led from the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, the weight of the moment pressing down like a final, crushing blow. Outside, the protests raged on. But inside, the system had spoken. And it was done. The walls of the maximum security prison were bare, cold, and unyielding. The cell was small, just large enough for a cot, a metal toilet, and a narrow table bolted to the floor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an artificial glow that never changed, blurring the passage of time. Days passed without distinction, measured only by the routine of meals shoved through the slot in the door and the sound of distant footsteps echoing down the corridor. Darius Holloway had been imprisoned for a year. He spoke to no one. The guards kept their distance, their expressions unreadable, their voices clipped and professional. The other inmates regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Some had seen his face on the news, recognized his name from the headlines that had once dominated every screen in America. He was the soldier who had killed 15 of his own. A monster to some, a martyr to others. Outside, the world had not moved on. The trial had ended, but the story had not. What should have been a closed case had instead become something else, an unhealed wound, festering beneath the surface of a country that no longer knew what to do with it. The scandal had only grown. The military had tried to erase him, to cast him as an anomaly, a lone failure in an otherwise disciplined force. But people were still asking questions. Investigative journalists had started digging deeper, unearthing buried complaints, testimonies of other soldiers who had suffered the same torment. Whistleblowers came forward. Former recruits, now civilians, shared their stories, accounts of hazing, unchecked violence, and the silent complicity of commanding officers who had turned a blind eye. The government had no choice but to respond. Senate hearings were held. High-ranking officials were called to testify under oath, their carefully composed statements torn apart by relentless questioning. Reports surfaced detailing systemic failures, instances where abuse had been ignored, where those who spoke up had been silenced or discharged. The commanding officers at Fort Kavanaugh were removed from duty. Some retired quietly, their careers ending in disgrace. Others faced criminal charges, negligence, obstruction, failure to maintain discipline. None of them received sentences as severe as Darius had. Public pressure mounted. The outrage was no longer just about one soldier's crime. It was about everything that had led to it. Legislation was drafted. New laws were passed, introducing stricter oversight within military training programs. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented, allowing soldiers to file complaints without fear of retaliation. Specialized units were created to investigate harassment and abuse, their sole purpose to ensure that what had happened to Darius would not happen again. It was change. It was reform. But it was too late. The 15 recruits who had died that night would not be coming back. Their families still grieved, still demanded justice. And Darius Holloway remained locked away, his life reduced to the confines of a prison cell. Some called it justice. Others called it sacrifice. 1 year after the trial, a message appeared on the wall of the U.S. Military Academy. The words were written in thick, black paint, bold against the pale stone. You didn't break him. You created him. By morning, it had been scrubbed away. But the words had already spread, captured in photographs, shared across social media, repeated in whispered conversations. The Army had changed. But the cost had already been paid.